Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a totally fascinating philosophical framework by the author Su Feng. We're going to unpack the deep underlying mechanics of how we actually make decisions and navigate the world. Specifically, we're looking at the really compelling contrast between rational thinking and spiritual thinking. Whether you're the kind of person who meticulously plans every detail, or you're more of a spontaneous, free spirit, this framework offers an absolutely incredible lens to view your daily life through. Let's get right into it. So, to kick things off, just think about that familiar old saying, when humans make plans, God laughs, right? The author uses this really poignant idea to set up the core tension of the whole text. Because on one hand, we have this massive human desire to calculate, to strategize, and to completely control our outcomes. But on the other hand, there's this vast, totally unpredictable cosmic flow that just seems to operate completely independently of all our spreadsheets and calendars. And that exact tension is what we're going to untangle today. But, to really untangle this, we first need to see how human behavior maps onto a much broader hierarchy. The source text actually categorizes people based on what they ultimately rely on to navigate their existence. It is such a fascinating way to segment human consciousness, and it sets the stage perfectly for us to understand exactly where rationality and spirituality sit on the whole spectrum of human development. So, building up this metaphorical ladder step by step. Right at the base, the ignorant rely purely on instinct. Then moving up, worldly people rely on personal gain, while mortals rely heavily on their emotions. But right up at the peak, well, that's where we find our focus for today. The text states that wise people rely on rationality, and celestial beings rely on spirituality. According to the author, these are the absolute highest levels of human operation. So, what exactly is a rational thinker in this context? Well, the text defines them objectively as someone who thoroughly deliberates on, everything. They play by the rules of the real world, they lean heavily on gathered knowledge, and they meticulously analyze their potential gains and losses before making a single move. Basically, they're the ultimate planners. They're always trying to prevent disaster long before it ever strikes. Now, conversely, a spiritual thinker operates in a completely different ballpark. The text describes this mindset as someone who just acts according to their natural state. They respond to circumstances and destiny totally spontaneously. Instead of building a giant spreadsheet of probabilities, they pay deep attention to their initial feelings. They make prompt decisions, and they don't agonize over the consequences, basically trusting the flow of what the author calls the Tao. So you can really see how this creates a pretty stark philosophical divide. The mantra of the rational mind is super cautious and calculated. Think thrice before acting. Meanwhile, the mantra of the spiritual mind is unhesitating and fluid. Act according to nature. One mindset is constantly seeking to control its environment, while the other is just seeking to harmonize with it. Let's dive a little deeper into the actual mechanics of this rational thinking. This mindset operates on very strict logic. A rational thinker is constantly summarizing past experiences, weighing every single pro and con, and actively trying to seek out good fortune while dodging disaster. And honestly, in our modern society, we usually view this as the absolute pinnacle of responsibility, right? It's a whole mindset built around self-preservation and calculated success. But here's the catch. The author points out that this highly protective nature actually comes with a pretty heavy psychological burden. A rational thinker is often consumed by thoughts like, beware of others, ask a few more questions, or be cautious of being deceived. So while it's definitely practical, this kind of thinking is inherently rooted in deep skepticism, extreme caution, and this underlying fear of negative outcomes. Okay, now let's flip it back to the mechanics of the spiritual thinker. They completely abandon all of that calculation. They just respond spontaneously, and they actively ignore personal gain. Amazingly, the text notes they don't even worry about future necessities, like food or clothing. No way, right? Instead, they operate with this totally open, upright demeanor, completely devoid of cunning. The author actually compares this directly to the pure innocence and complete trust of a baby. To really drive home what acting on this pure, uncalculated nature looks like, the author uses a very vivid, somewhat funny metaphor. They say the spiritual thinker lives simply, laying eggs when it's time to lay eggs, crowing when it's time to crow, living when it's time to live, and dying when it's time to die. It's literally the ultimate acceptance of your natural function, totally free from any anxiety about the future. So what is actually driving this massive difference in behavior? Well, it all boils down to ultimate trust. You see, the rational thinker fundamentally believes in human control, worldly rules, and their own intellect. On the flip side, the spiritual thinker operates on a belief in the greatest creator, along with an absolute trust in cause and effect. They just give their best effort every single day, and they literally leave the rest up to the universe. At this point in the explainer, the text really zooms out to this sweeping cosmic perspective. It starts addressing the ultimate futility of constantly trying to outsmart life. The author suggests that our human schemes, no matter how brilliant we think they are, simply cannot alter the grander workings of the universe. In fact, pushing past the limits of human calculation often triggers the exact opposite of what the rational thinker was going for in the first place. To show us exactly how this human scheming backfires, the author drops a cascade of traditional proverbs. Take this one, for example. A true gentleman does not seek blessings, yet heaven guides him to fulfill his true intentions. A cunning person tries to avoid misfortune, yet heaven seizes his soul at the very moment he schemes. It absolutely hits the nail on the head, highlighting the wild paradox that aggressively trying to control your outcomes is often exactly what destroys them. The text then rolls right into this classic warning: cleverness may overreach itself. Basically, when we rely way too heavily on our rational minds to manipulate situations, we end up creating massive blind spots for ourselves. It's like the very intellect we're using to protect ourselves suddenly becomes the exact trap we fall right into. And finally, we get this super memorable proverb to cap off the whole point. The fox knew too much. That's how he lost his tail. It's such a fantastic representation of the hidden dangers of over-intellectualizing everything. Being overly cautious and super calculated can ultimately cost you pieces of yourself. We're talking about your peace of mind, your spontaneity, and your genuine connection to the flow of life. Now, to mathematically emphasize exactly why rational planning is so limited, the author poses a really interesting question regarding the number 64. The idea is that everything operates within the Tao, right? So out of the astronomical combinations of these 64 universal factors, how many can a human mind truly understand? The point here is that the universe is just infinitely complex. It doesn't matter how smart you are, your rational mind simply cannot process the endless astronomical permutations of reality. It's just impossible. Because we literally can't compute all those infinite variables, the text offers a pretty striking philosophical conclusion. It says, "The way of the sage is to abandon wisdom and cunning. Without abandoning wisdom and cunning, it is difficult to maintain constancy." So, true stability, it doesn't come from trying to plan for every possible contingency. It actually comes from dropping that self-serving calculation altogether and just trusting the process. This all builds up to a super fascinating paradox about human judgment itself. The text says, misfortune, that is where happiness depends. Happiness, that is where misfortune underlies. Think about it. When your rational mind insists a decision is absolutely right, it might ultimately be totally wrong. And when you think you've made a terrible, wrong move, that might just be the very thing that leads to your greatest success. The way we rationally label events as good or bad is just deeply, deeply flawed. So, bringing this whole thing together, we finally see these two mindsets face to face. On one side, we have the rational thinker, constantly thinking things through, super cautious, highly meticulous. And on the other, the spiritual thinker, completely adaptable, totally carefree, just flowing with the Tao. Now, the author doesn't demand you pick a side instantly, but rather just imparts this framework so we can see the profound, real-world consequences of operating within each one. So, I'm going to leave you with a question to mull over in your own life. Next time you're faced with a major challenge or a really big decision, do you meticulously weigh every single pro and con, or do you just trust your nature and flow with the Tao? Take a moment to reflect on what your default setting really is and how it's actually shaping your reality. Thanks so much for joining me to explore this explainer today.